Joining me now is Congressman Krishnamoorthi. He's a Democratic member of the House Oversight Committee, which just received those notes from Donald Trump's call with the Attorney General. He's also a member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, where he has also done work, investigative work into what Donald Trump has been up to. Congressman, good to see you this evening. There is a trove of information here.
Same here.
Starting with the point that the Attorney General is not the president's lawyer. It's not someone who's there to do the bidding of the president. So there's all sorts of inappropriateness about everything that's going on. But it goes so much further than that. This threat that Katie's talking about of replacing someone if you don't do my bidding. The fact that you don't actually have to find wrongdoing. You just have to say you did. Call the election a fraud, and I'll handle the rest. This is mind-blowing after a 4 years that you didn't think you could have your mind blown anymore.
It's extraordinary evidence of the extent to which that Donald Trump would meddle in the elections and have the DOJ do his bidding. But then also how close we were to having the DOJ do his bidding, because as you rightly pointed out with Katie in the previous segment, Jeff Clark was probably tasked with doing exactly what Mr. Rosen and Mr. Donahue refused to do, which is to call the election corrupt. The other part of it, which I find fascinating, is the part where he says, leave the rest to me and the Republican congressman. I don't know what that means, Ali. I don't know what they had in store, whether they had planned for this DOJ maneuver to take place, and then they had certain steps to follow. But that's equally disturbing as well.
Who gets to the bottom of that? Is that the January 6th Select Committee, or is that you on the Oversight Committee? Because I would very much like to know the answers to those questions that you just asked.
I think we're going to probe hard on this. I know that I have a lot of questions, for instance, about he brought up Jim Jordan in that conversation. He brought up Ron Johnson, the senator from Wisconsin, who he says, quote unquote, gets to the bottom of things. And we just don't know what they were planning to do right after this. However, now that the Justice Department has basically allowed the Oversight Committee and us to do our investigation unimpeded by the prospect of executive privilege, we can get at the emails. We can get at other documents. Now we can bring witnesses in and actually have hearings and so forth.
Why do you think, when we were all playing this out, the way things go over the last 4 years, there was an assumption, certainly about with me and some other people who thought there'll be some injunction to getting these notes released, that Trump's people would act on it, and they didn't. Is it hubris? They don't think anything's wrong with it? Does he not have lawyers? What do you think happened here? How do you think these notes went from being reported and leaked and to your committee as fast as they did?
I don't know all the behind-the-scenes action, but what I do know is Richard Donahue and the authors of these notes knew exactly what they were doing in taking them because they knew that what was going on didn't meet the smell test, to say the least, and likely could raise legal questions and illegality on the part of the president. One of the things that you didn't mention before in drawing analogies was the Brad Raffensperger call, where President Trump asked Brad Raffensperger to find 11,780 votes to overturn the Georgia election. And in Georgia. And basically, election experts at that time did not think that folks would prosecute that particular behavior in that call under the state and federal election laws because the evidence wasn't what they wanted. But now the evidence is starting to pile up, and we have to ask ourselves the question, what other types of calls exist? We know about the Raffensperger call. We know about this DOJ call. Who else did he talk to, and what did he ask them to do as well?
Yeah, you're right in that there are similarities to that call as well. Play this out for me. Let's say he had called Rosen at the Department of Justice, and Rosen had done his bidding, or someone had done his bidding, or Trump put his guy in place and did their... What would the effect of that be? End of December 2020, Department of Justice comes out and says what Trump wants them to say. The elections were corrupt. What do you think happens in an instance like that?
That would have been disastrous, Allie. Basically what it would have done is thrown the whole election aftermath into even more chaos, and it would have been the prelude for basically going to each of the state capitals, which they already were doing, the Trump folks, and basically asking them to basically undo the decertification or decertify their elections. And of course, it would have provided more grist for what they were doing on January 6th. To me, this call, it's almost like Donald Trump, if this were a bank heist, Donald Trump was basically telling people, okay, Justice Department, you drive this car, crash it through the windows of the bank window and the vault, and I'll take it from here. So much damage would have happened had the Justice Department carried this out. I shudder to think of what more would have happened on January 6th, a day that I lived through as well as my colleagues and the whole nation lived through, and a lot of people remain traumatized as a consequence.
Congressman, good to see you tonight. There will be some interesting reading for you and your fellow committee members. Congressman Roger Krishnamoorthi.
Yes, sir.
All right.